Yeah, welcome back in the post-T session. We have one pedagogical lecture that will be given by Professor Subimal Ghosh from Center for Climate Studies and Civil Engineering at IIT Bombay. He will be talking about role of land-atmosphere interactions and probably also role of, probably will try to motivate a bit about how the role of carbon cycle is emerging as one of the key issues. Professor Ghosh, thanks a lot for agreeing to deliver this talk. Over to you.
Thanks, Vishal. I'm sorry I could not join in person because we had certain things at the institute, so I had to I had to present in the institute. So I'm giving this talk virtually. So yeah, just a minute.
Subimal, can you hide the controls?
Yeah, it's I have yeah. Is that okay? Is this okay now?
Not yet. Still the top right. Yeah, I think this is good. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So happening. Yeah. Yeah. So, when I'll talk about land atmospheric feedback, but before that, I'll go back to 2012, where there was a paper by Schaeffer et al. And when it talks about forcing and feedback networks. And let us try to understand what does it mean by forcing and feedback networks. So whenever you're looking at a climate system, so before that, I'd like to highlight that climate doesn't mean just atmosphere and ocean. There is a land component, which is a very strong component and which is a very important component. And also there is a human component, which is biosphere. So, which is a part of biosphere. So the idea here is that, when we look at climate system just from atmospheric angle or just from, ocean angle or just from both the things together, and when we keep on neglecting the land component, what happens is that, will the failure or the stress, the impact of stress on that system, when you look at it, it comes from, let's say, one component is getting stressed, that goes to another component, the another component is getting stressed, then it goes to another component, and so on. So that's the way we look at into the system. For example, if you have to understand the impacts of certain climate stress on hydrology, we first do climate model, get the output, and then go on hydrology. So it's a step-by-step procedure. And then what do we exactly miss? What we miss exactly is that, so what normally happens if we consider a conventional approach, it will say a systematic failure. And when it is a systematic failure, you will see like this kind of failure. But what exactly happens is that in a network system, whenever there is a stress, there will be always a resistance by each component to to resist that sort of change, and there will be always continuous local repairs, which will have a feedback. So what the system will try to do, system will try to resist the changes, and at some point of time, it will not be able to do that, and there will be a complete failure and maybe crossing tipping point and so on and so forth, which we of course talk about. So the idea here is that the way we model and the way the system behaves, they are entirely different. And for that purpose, what is important is that the feedback process, the land atmospheric feedback process, is very important. The way human is actually contributing and what is their feedback, they become very important. And of course, the climate community have now understood that. So we can see a lot of articles and a lot of works which are coming out, which are specifically focusing on how biosphere is actually giving feedback to the climate system. So when you're talking about land to atmospheric feedback, and then the basic question is that, when you're talking about the water cycle, we know these big arrows which are coming from ocean and it goes to atmosphere. There's a lot of dynamics which are taking place, and these are essentially hydrological process. And there is a small arrow which is of course coming from terrestrial vegetation and also human use and so on, which is evapotranspiration. So what is the role of this evapotranspiration to the climate system, and specifically for Indian monsoon? Because Indian monsoon land processes were always neglected till 2012, 2013. So the question here is that what exactly is the role of this land component, which is which, of course, after 2014, 2015, people have started giving attention to this, but before that, it was not really properly, understood. So before going into this, land atmospheric feedback, we'll go to a very basic question. So essentially, when you're talking about Indian monsoon, we know that it has a 10% coefficient of variation. That means its standard deviation to mean ratio is 10%. And based on that, we say if it is 110%, we call it a all India monsoon rainfall average. Of course, we call it a surplus year, and if it is less than 90%, we call it a deficit year. So what is this 10%? What does it mean? Now, one of the interesting thing, if you look at it, if you consider the India's rainfall map with coefficient of variation. Essentially, I'm showing the coefficient of variation. If you go at individual grids, you will find that all the grids have greater than 20% coefficient of variation, and some of the grids even have 50 to 60% coefficient of variation, but they are mostly over the arid region simply because the mean rainfall is quite low. But if you look at this kind of plot where essentially this is the mean grid precipitation and this is the coefficient of variation, you'll get this kind of plot. We'll see the all India average is somewhere here, and you can see this is the coefficient of variation. So the question here is that almost all the regions have greater than 20% coefficient of variation, but yes, all India is constrained by 10%. What's the reason? And if you look at it, if you look at intra-seasonal variation or interannual variation, things would be a bit clear. So always, the central India and northeast India, we find most of the cases they are actually produce some kind of east-west asymmetry. When central India receives high rainfall, the northeast region receives low rainfall, and opposite. So it happens at intra-seasonal scale and also happens at interannual scale. Now let us look into the all India monsoon rainfall for different regions. What is the rainfall value? And if you plot the coefficient, if you plot the covariance, you will find that central India has a very strong negative covariance with the northeast India at interannual scale, which is visible with the IMD data as well as ERA analysis data. And that's one of the reason this kind of coefficient of variation will try to pull back or constrain the coefficient of variation to around 10%. So individually, these two regions have very high coefficient of variation. But if you are talking about all India monsoon rainfall, they try to constrain it to 10%. So that it has also a significant implications because most of the government of India decisions are coming from 110% and 90%. Many policy decisions comes from that. So we have to revisit that. Now the question here is that now what is the contribution of how to quantify the land contribution? So the entire work started when one of my student Amay Pathak, who is now a assistant professor at IIT Kharagpur. So when he started looking into it, and I started collaborating with one of our collaborator from IISc, Professor Praveen Kumar. So we wanted to quantify the land contribution or the land contribution to the atmospheric moisture budget. And what we did is that we are considering atmospheric water budget equation and did the Lagrangian backtracking. And when it talks about recycled precipitation, so let's say if you're talking about a region and we are trying to understand from that region if some evapotranspiration is taking place, how much it contributes to the rainfall that is happening over the same region. So that is known as recycled precipitation. And if you are considering recycling ratio, that means recycled precipitation by total precipitation. Now, when you compute the recycled precipitation, what you will find is that if you go from June to September, so let us look into the recycling ratio, this region. So this second row of plots. So you can see that in the June recycling ratio is quite low, which is quite obvious because during the June the crops and also the vegetation is not at that mature state because monsoon onset has just taken place, and the soil moisture is not in a good condition. Soil doesn't have much of moisture. The vegetation is at is not at a mature scale, so that evapotranspiration contribution is quite low. But when you go from June to July, July to August, and August to September, this recycling ratio keeps on increasing because the vegetation gets matured, the soil moisture keeps on increasing, and the recycling ratio keep on increasing. And it, at the end of September, you can see that over the central India and northeast region, the recycling ratio reaches around 25%, 0.25, which is a quite significant amount. So we can say that this recycling, the land contribution to the moisture, atmospheric moisture, helps to retain moisture in the September, or sustain the moisture, sustain the monsoon rainfall in September. So this was done by Amay Pathak. Then we wanted to see, that was sort of a average scale. Then we wanted to see what exactly is happening at an inter-annual scale. So what we have found is that there is a east-west asymmetry and there is a north-south asymmetry, and we wanted to find out what does it mean. As I've already said that if you the north-south asymmetry is quite clear, because when Indian landmass receives high rainfall, the Indian Ocean receives low anomaly rainfall, and so on and so forth. But the other thing is that the east-west asymmetry, and when Amay started applying this Lagrangian backtracking, what he has found is that when Gangetic Basin receives, so I'd like to mention that if you go to, what the plots where I have shown that the Gangetic Basin and the Northeast India, they are essentially the major hotspot of land atmospheric feedback, and this was earlier mentioned in 2004 in a very famous paper by Coaster et al., which was a global analysis, and where it was shown that Ganga Basin is one of the major land atmospheric hotspot, land atmospheric feedback hotspot. So now if you look at this east-west asymmetry, you can see that when Ganga Basin contribution, that means the contribution that is coming from land, which when it is contributing positive to the to this region, it is in the west side, it is east side, it is producing a negative anomaly, and vice versa. So essentially, so this is what is very important. So this is about good monsoon year minus bad monsoon year, and you can see that there is an east-west asymmetry, and this east-west asymmetry is being contributed by land region. Whereas if you're considering the Western Indian Ocean contribution, which is Arabian Sea contribution, they essentially produce the north-south asymmetry. So north-south asymmetry is by ocean, but east-west asymmetry is primarily by the land. Now let us go back again, role of land in constraining the 10% coefficient of variation. So what we tried to do is that we tried to find out the contribution of land to Central India surplus years and Central India deficit years, and we are trying to understand what exactly is happening. So you can see that when there is a Central India surplus year, the Northeast is actually receiving low moisture from the land region, and of course Central India surplus year, it is reaching high contribution from the land region over the Central Indian region, Central Indian region, and the exactly opposite thing is happening. So to summarize, it says that when Central India receives a surplus rainfall, that means land is contributing lower to the Northeast region, and Northeast region is actually getting a low rainfall. Similarly, for Central India deficit years, the land is contributing high rainfall to the Northeast region, but low rainfall over the Central Indian region. So this east-west asymmetry, the land is actually contributing quite significantly, and this is what one of our student Bikram Chandal did. Now it is about interannual scale. Now if you go to intra-seasonal scale, yes, it is, it's quite a very similar thing, which again it gets translated to interannual scale. So now, what Amay tried to do, I'll again go back to 2017, where Amay completed this work, and Amay tried to understand that what are the contribution of Ganga Basin and Central Indian Ocean to this, east-west and north-south asymmetry at intra-seasonal scale, and it was very similar what we exactly found. So if you're talking about Ganga Basin contribution, you can see that Ganga Basin, the evapotranspiration contribution that is coming from the land of Ganga Basin, it results into east-west asymmetry. And if you're considering the ocean contribution, if you're considering Western Indian Ocean or Central Indian Ocean or Upper Indian Ocean, you will find that they essentially they primarily contribute to the north-south asymmetry. So north-south asymmetry is primarily being contributed by the oceans, and east-west asymmetry is primarily contributed by land. And remember, this east-west asymmetry is also trying to constrain the Indian monsoon rainfall coefficient of variation by 10%. So entire the backtracking study gives us a very important information that land contribution is important if we really have to understand properly what are the reason of interannual variability at a local level, not at just at a country level. Now the second problem, which is a kind of a well-known problem, which we know that the CFS-V2 has a dry bias over the Indian landmass, and if you compute it with GPCP and ERA interim, you will find a dry bias. And of course, there are other region, the Indian Ocean region, they have little bit of wet bias. So we wanted to understand that if you do some regional modeling and do a high resolution regional modeling, whether does it really improve the dry bias condition. So what we tried to do is that we did a regional land atmosphere modeling. This was done by one of our student Anjana Devanand, who completed her PhD, and after doing postdoc she is now a permanent employee at CSIRO. So what Anjana did is that Anjana, of course, ran the land atmosphere modeling with more detailed atmospheric component and with with CLM as well as NOAA LSM, both the models she has used. So what she was focusing more on the Ganga Basin region, and what she has found is that when you're doing a very detailed high resolution land, if you couple it with atmospheric modeling and do the work simulation, the dry bias over the Ganga Basin is getting reduced. Of course, there are other regions where their bias is getting magnified, but mostly interesting part was that over the Ganga Basin, the dry bias is getting reduced from 68% to 25% and 13% with two different land model. And this was published in GRL, and AG also selected this as a research spotlight. So now what she wanted to do, it can be just a coincidence that somehow with the model it is working very well. So but what she wanted to make sure that there is some reason because of which it is happening. So she wanted to do a detailed analysis with again the moisture tracking, where she wanted to sort of backtrack the moisture and trying to understand what exactly is happening. So as expected, if you have a better land component, the recycle component will. Now, first let us look at the CFS-V2 simulations and ERA. So if you look at CFS-V2 and ERA, you can clearly see that everywhere, if it comes to ocean, if it comes to land, or if it comes to total, everywhere the ERA is having high value and CFS-V2 is underestimating. Now, when you are using WRF CLM or WRF NOAA, NOAA LSM, it is kind of expected that the land contribution should improve. And this is what is getting improved. You can see that recycle component, which is the red one, the bold one is from ERA, and the dotted one is from CLM. You can see that it has improved, where you can look at here, there was a huge difference. But the interesting part was that we also found that even the ocean contribution have also improved quite significantly. You can see that this is the blue one and this is the green one, how much difference they have. And this has actually improved quite significantly. So we are trying to understand what exactly happening there. Sorry, when we're trying to understand that, what we have found is that one of the reason could be like this. So when you're having a very high resolution and proper representation of Himalaya, so the extratropical circulation that is coming, Himalaya is topping that. So the Indian landmass is not getting, so normally Indian landmass is warm before the monsoon, but what is happening in the model is that it allows the extratropical cold air to enter the landmass, and that reduces the temperature, and that results into misrepresentation of land ocean contrast, and that results into decreased circulation from ocean to atmosphere, and that results into some dry bias, which is further improved when we have a proper representation Himalaya and so on, and the blocking of extratropical air. So that is something which we found, and which could be a possible reason for for this improvement. So this is more about monsoon simulations. That now let us look into the vegetation. So vegetation is another very important component, and vegetation have a strong variability. So we wanted to understand that how vegetation really react to climate variability and what sort of feedback it tries to give. So let's say if you're talking about any kind of hydroclimatic changes in terms of variability or change, it has impact on land. But we have to also understand that plants can also adapt, and plants also strategize, plants also acclimatize. And when they do that, that has some significant impact on water cycle. For example, if plants understand that there is a dry condition, they will try to reduce the evapotranspiration. And when they will try to reduce the evapotranspiration, that will affect the feedback. And again, the entire cycle will get disturbed. So this is something which we have to understand. So if you don't consider this kind of a vegetation acclimatization or plant strategy, it will have significant problem. So we wanted to understand that how does really plants or vegetation or biosphere really contribute to the monsoon simulation. So what we did, we used two methods. One is of course the dynamic methods, where we have used the regional models with where we are using ECMWF data as a boundary condition. We have used WRF CLM. And what we have used is that we have used Moody's LULC. So one, we have considered the leaf area index, the plant leaf area index. We have considered climatological leaf area index. And second one, what we have considered is that we have considered interannually varying leaf area index. So both the things we have considered, we run it in WRF CLM, and we try to understand what sort of differences we are getting in terms of simulated variables. And so it essentially tells you that the way vegetation reacts to monsoon every year, what are their specific feedback to the entire, different climate or monsoon variable simulations. And then we further analyze this with information theory based process network. So this is some kind of a method by which we can understand that what causes what. So essentially, the idea was to essentially to understand the land atmospheric feedback using the entropy, which is known as Shannon's entropy. So when we did that, first I'll show you that what are the results we have got. Then what we have found is that when you are using climatological LAI, we got a correlation coefficient of interannual variation of 0.385. But when you are allowing the LAI to vary, it just improves from 0.385 to 0.507. So it is improving, and we have found that for more extreme cases, it is improving much better. And you can see that most of the improvements you can see over this region, Ganga Basin and Central India, these are the regions, even Northeast India. So these are the regions where we find quite a significant improvement. And if you remember, I have already mentioned that Ganga Basin is one of the major hotspots for land atmospheric feedback. And that clearly shows that over this region, the land atmospheric feedback is quite high, and they have significant contribution to monsoon rainfall. Now, what we wanted to understand is that we wanted to understand using a statistical method, which is essentially transfer entropy based process network method, and we wanted to understand what exactly is happening. So we use the method which is known as entropy. So I'll just explain what does it mean by Shannon's entropy. Shannon's entropy is the probabilistic mean of surprise, which is the basic measure of information theory. So what does it mean by surprise? Surprise means that event which is having lowest probability. That is called surprise. And why is it important? I'll just give a very simple example, not really a climate example, but a very simple example. Let's say, you have to catch your flight from your venue to, and you have to go to Bangalore airport. And your flight is at the midnight. So what you can do is that that in the midnight you don't have much of traffic, so you can start little late, and you'll surely reach the airport. And someone tells you, yeah, so in the night there will be not much of traffic, you can easily reach the airport. That if you get that information, you will not give much weight to that, because they are not very important to you. It is already known to you that in night the traffic will be less. But let's say someone comes and tells you a lot of construction activities or something is happening on the way to airport, and there will be a huge road blockage. So you have to start early, because then it will be a surprise to you, and you will give a lot of importance to that information because it's a surprise. It's least probable that in the night there will be traffic jam, but that is what is happening. So you are actually giving a lot of importance. So what entropy does, entropy essentially finds out the probabilistic mean of this surprise. And when it comes to joint entropy, essentially it talks about the joint, it's very same as the joint probability. It's called joint entropy. And then what we try to do, we compute mutual information, which is then similar to as joint probability. And then we'll go for transfer entropy. So transfer entropy is something interesting. In transfer entropy, what we try to do is that we try to understand, let's say we have variables xt plus 1, xt and ys. So ys is the source variable and x is the target variable, let us consider. And you want to understand if y is causing x or not. So for that purpose, what we try to do is that from xt plus 1, we take out the information that is coming from xt, that is the past of x. So whatever is coming from the past of x, we take out that. And then we try to understand how y is actually affecting x, or how much information is going from y to x, t plus 1. And that tells you if the past of y is actually really affecting x, conditional on the past of x. And this is known as transfer entropy, some measure of causality, but causality is a very complex thing. So you cannot really get exact causality, and we are working on multiple other theories, specifically on core statistics. But here I'd like to focus I'll just tell you that we have used transfer entropy and we developed a process network with that. Now these are essentially the land variables. You can see these are different land variables like latent heat flux, sensible heat flux, soil moisture, evapotranspiration, and so on and so forth. So these are all land variables, and these are the precipitation over different regions. So these are one, two. So these are essentially different regions, and these are the precipitation over different regions. And what we wanted to, this kind of network helps us to understand how much information is going from these land variables to the monsoon rainfall. And if you look at 1, 3, and 4, so you can see that these are the regions 1 and 5. These are the Central India, North, Gangetic Basin. They receive quite a significant information from the land region. So that shows that land variables are contributing quite significantly in varying the precipitation. So essentially it tells you the variability of causing variables, the impact of the variability of causing variables on the target variables. And you can see here is that the feedback from the land variables significantly impact the variability of the monsoon precipitation at local regions. Now what we wanted to see is that does it really change for drought years or flood years? And when we looked at it, we have found a very interesting observation. What we have found is that if you consider the drought years, we found that drought years have more number of links compared to the wet years. So if you consider the surplus years have lower number of links, and drought years have more number of links. And this is quite visible for if you're talking about number of transfer entropy links which are coming from land variables. Now, I want to explain it in this way. For example, I give this example to many of my students also. So whenever a system is under stress, it will try to generate more number of links to resist the change. For example, let's say if you take about a very simple physical example, let's say a few of the friends, they are trying to cross a river. If it's a very there's not much of water in that river, so you can easily cross it if there is not much of current. But if there is a huge current, what the friends will do, they will hold each other's hand to cross the river. So similarly, the system also works like that. Whenever there is a stress, they will generate more number of links to resist those stress, and through that probably, and that's what probably is happening here, where we can see that in drought years, land atmospheric feedback is quite high compared to the surplus years. The other reason could be because the moisture contributions from land or the recycling ratio becomes very high because the ocean contribution is a bit less. So there may be multiple reasons, multiple ways to look into it, but this is an important information that land contributions and land variability have significant impacts on monsoon rainfall, specifically over the dry regions. So now comes, human natural system. So now, till now, what we have talked about is that we are talking about only natural system. And when we are talking about natural system, we are not really considering the human water management practices, for example, irrigation and so on and so forth. But we know that over the last, you know, 30 to 40 years, the irrigation has used quite significantly. So the irrigation has increased quite significantly, and because of which, what's happening is that our water cycle is getting impacted. For example, if you're considering the irrigation, you can see that over the Gangetic Basin there is a significant amount of irrigation, and most of the irrigation is groundwater fed. Now, if you think about the irrigation modules which are available in community land model, what they consider is that the major crops which are being considered, even in the hydrological models, there is a model called VIC, which has been randomly and widely used for Indian region. But one of the major thing what is missing, and which I keep on highlighting, is that these models consider major crops as maize and soybean and so on and so forth. But if you are considering the Indian region, specifically the Gangetic Basin, it's paddy. The major crop during the Kharif season is paddy. And if you're looking at the paddy fields are something like this. They are always in the submerged condition. So there is a pond like situation which has a completely different hydrology compared to if you're considering maize or any other crops. So, and that results into quite significant differences. So what we wanted to understand, what are the impacts of this irrigation to the monsoon rainfall? So Anjana did this work, and we performed 3 simulations. One is control simulations where there is no irrigation and no paddy fields. The second one is when we are considering the census data of irrigation, which is available from Government of India. And also there is some paper which gives us some irrigation data. And also when you are considering paddy fields, I'd like to mention is that Anjana here developed a specific module for paddy fields and Indian irrigation, which is already available which is freely available. So this is specifically Indianized land component of WRF CLM model. And this is what we named as a IRR simulation. And the third one is the idealistic irrigation, where whenever soil moisture goes below a certain value, you start irrigation. It never happens in India because the farmers do not have they cannot really afford soil moisture sensors, so they cannot tell that soil moisture, the root zone soil moisture, which is not surface soil moisture. When the root zone soil moisture goes below certain value, I'll start irrigation and so on. It's not like that. There is an uncontrolled irrigation, and that results into a lot of water wastage as well. But what we are trying to tell is that if you are considering the difference between the irrigation, no paddy fields, which is being widely used by people who are using WRF CLM and so on, and what is the realistic irrigation, if you take the difference, is quite high. You can see that the amount of irrigation difference in terms of millimeter per day over Gangetic Basin is around 6 millimeter per day, which is quite significant. Now what we try to understand is that if we see the difference, we can see that a spatial pattern gets disturbed even if you start doing this kind of irrigation. I mean, if you change your irrigation practice. For example, if you have a irrigation which is the standard irrigation, and if you have a irrigation which is ideal irrigation, you can see that the differences are actually changes. So that is another important component. The story it tells you that even if you perturb your human water management component on the land, it has the potential to significantly impact the monsoon spatial pattern of monsoon rainfall. And this was again published in GRL in 2019. Now there is another thing. So where we are all talking about heat waves, and we are talking about wet heat stress. So I'll go back to 2 papers. One paper was published in Nature Communication in 2019 by a ETH group, where it was mentioned that irrigation results into cooling over Indian region during the heat wave season, which is March, April, May. The other paper told that, which was again published in Nature Geoscience, which told us that, over the Indo-Gangetic Basin, irrigation results into a cooling of 8 degrees centigrade, as high as 8 degrees centigrade, but moist heat stress increasing because it has results into humidity. Now let us look into this and trying to understand what exactly is happening, because we are talking about 7 to 8 degrees decrease in temperature because of irrigation. Is it really possible? So when you look into the model, their model simulations, what we have found is that these are either global models or the models which are borrowed from Western countries where the irrigation practice is based on Western regions. So in the mostly what is being done is that during the summertime, when that is a proper crop season, and when the soil moisture goes below a certain value, it starts irrigating. So March, April, May, which is not our main crop season, so there, if you induce a lot of irrigation and lot of cropping, then what will happen? The soil moisture is always dry because it is very high temperature time with almost no rainfall is coming. So what is happening? Your soil moisture always gets high, and your model is pouring a lot of water and for producing the crops. And that results into very, very high irrigation. But in reality, this is not a crop season, this is not an irrigation season. So it is totally total misrepresentation of human water management practice over the Indian region that results into misleading conclusions related to increase of wet heat stress and decrease of temperature by 8 degrees centigrade in March, April, May over the Indian landmass. So one of our student, Roshan Jha, who wanted to understand what exactly is happening. It's very clear from the Modi city data that there is not much of evapotranspiration over this region. You can compare the Kharif and the March, April, May. You can see that evapotranspiration is quite low, and this is because the vegetation is also quite low. It is not a cropping season. And then we performed a very detailed work simulations, and what we have found is that of course there is a little bit of irrigation. There are few crops which are being grown, and because of which the temperature drops only by -4 degrees centigrade. We can see that very little decrease in temperature is being observed compared to 8 degrees centigrade. It is -4 to 0.42 degrees centigrade with little bit of uncertainty band. And agriculture, because this is, and hence it shows that irrigation does not have much of feedback on the heat waves. If it has any kind of feedback, that is during the monsoon season, at the end of monsoon season, even not at the beginning of monsoon season, during the end of monsoon season, during September, when the crops are at mature stage and soil moisture is almost fully saturated. That's the time when land processes becomes really, really active, and they produce a lot of feedback. And this is one of the important thing which is just published in Nature Communications. Now the other thing, when you talk about monsoon, and we keep on talking about monsoon and land, and if you don't talk about the food, energy, water scenario in India, which is our consequences of monsoon, it will not be correct. So I specifically wanted to discuss, present this work. But before that, I'd like to tell you that, let us try to understand what exactly is happening at this moment in this country. So we know that our population is increasing. And when our population is increasing, we need to produce more food and more crop. And when we have to produce more food and more crop, we have to increase our agricultural activities. And at the same time, the temperature has increased. So your crop water demand has been increasing. And at the same time, what has happened? Of course, there has been a weakening of monsoon, but now scientists are claiming that it is revived, but revival is happening in terms of extremes, so it's not really helping. So your water availability is becoming low, and water demand is increasing. So you have to rely on more irrigation. Now, when you are relying on more irrigation, you are pumping groundwater. And when you are pumping groundwater is getting depleted. And at the end, what is happening is that every year you're depleting groundwater, so you need even more energy every year to extract the same amount of groundwater. So your irrigation cost is increasing and everything is increasing, and that will definitely have impact on crop prices. Even government is giving subsidies, but it has stopped, and thankfully in most of the regions. But it will finally be reflected in terms of tax or something else, and that will finally affect the food security of the people who are financially not that stable. So essentially, to solve a food security problem, you are bringing water security problem, more energy cost, and also without solving the food security. So this is one of the major trap we are now suffering, or we are inside this trap, and we have to think of coming out of this trap. And so that is what. And then the first question what will come is that are our agricultural crop practices really sustainable? So, if you are considering the Indo-Gangetic Basin, the three states, UP, Bihar, and West Bengal, we are focusing on, you'll see that if you consider trend of rainfall, of course, over the Uttar Pradesh region, there has been a decrease. Now, what we are trying to do is that in this analysis, this was done by Ruparati Chakraborty, one of our students, and we just published it in Nature Water. So, what we wanted to do is that we wanted to understand what is the major water consumption. We found that 70% of the water is being consumed over these regions for irrigation, and 50% of it for the cereal crops. So which is very important. That means it is for rice, for wheat, and so on and so forth. And if you consider the trend of water consumption, it has increased. That means we are consuming more crop, and that result more water. And when you are consuming more water, that of course improves little bit of kilocalorie production of the of these crops. It's the staple food. But what is happening is that you do not see much of improvement, even with lot of agricultural improvement and so on. You do not see the per unit water consumption. If you consider the kilocalorie production, it's not really improving quite significantly. But at the end, what is happening, that you can see that groundwater is getting depleted. This is the groundwater data which is collected from CGWB, Central Groundwater Board, and you can see that there has been a lot of depletion of groundwater. Then we tried to simulate the groundwater using the simple Central Water Commission model, and what we have found is that I must say that I must tell you that about the caveat is that this is not a very perfect model. It's a very kind of empirical model, but even with this empirical model, you can see that it is quite well matching with the pattern of the groundwater depletion. So it shows that groundwater depletion is actually happening in simulations as well as in observations, and that results into more energy consumption because of groundwater pumping. Now what we wanted to do is that we wanted to develop an optimization method. So it's a multi-objective optimization. Let's say if you just want to reduce the water use, people will not accept that, because at the same time we have to make sure that farmers' profit is continued, and we need to also produce the kilocalorie that is needed. So what we tried to do, we have at every district we have performed an optimization, of course with a proper crop model, etc. So we did that, and we ran this multi-objective optimization with the constraint is that the total crop area is not changing, only the crop switching is happening. One crop is getting switched to another crop. So when we did that, what we have found is that it shows that even in Indo-Gangetic Basin, which is supposed to be a kind of a region which has a lot of water available, even over this region, it shows that there is a need to go for more water intensive to less water intensive crops, like even going for millet, rice to millet and wheat to barley, and there is a need. And the other thing also what is coming out is that because this millet or barley, this kind of crops, they are more climate resilient, so they are even under climate stress, their production is not getting affected, and because of which they are getting produced by a significant quantity. And further it results into improvement in, of course the water use will definitely reduce, we all know that, but at the same time it improves the total kilocalorie production and also total profit, because your production is ensured because they are climate resilient. But one of the problem, of course, is that you have to create demand for these crops. Normally in India, we do not have much of demand for these crops, so there should be a policy which should increase the demand for these crops. And interesting part was that 2023 was the millet year to promote millet consumption, which, and also the other important part is that this kind of crop switching will not only improve total kilocalorie production, profit, etc., but also it will increase the nutrition value. We found that it will further increase 46% increase in the protein intake, 353% increase in iron, and 82% increase in zinc. So it shows it has quite significant implications in terms of other co-benefits. Now, this is another thing which we are trying to do, which is about river interlinking and proposed water management. So this is the work which is being done by one of my students, Tejasvi Chauhan, who is now at MPI doing postdoc. He just completed this work, and he published this paper, Nature Communication, very recently. So when you're talking about river interlinking, the assumption is that will make changes on land water management, and it will not affect the other region, because you always believe, if you're talking about river water basins have some boundary, and if you make changes in one river basin, that will not impact the other river basin, because there is a boundary and it should not affect. But what we keep on forgetting is that if you're talking about water cycle, terrestrial is just one component. There is an atmospheric component, and hydrologists often forget about that. Just like the climatologists often forget that land is a major component, specifically the monsoon scientists. In the same way, the hydrologists also forget that atmospheric water cycle is also a major component of water cycle. So this is what happening. So land atmospheric feedback, of course, is not being considered in a proper way. The second thing is, of course, through ocean. I mean, there is a lot of water that is reaching ocean that affects the salinity, and that will have impact on the atmosphere. There are quite a number of papers on this, but we are not focusing on that. We are just focusing on the land atmospheric feedback. So before doing any kind of analysis, what we wanted to understand is that if you are considering the land variables and develop a transfer entropy or a causal network kind of graph, we are trying to understand if land variable of one basin is affecting the land variable of another. And we found that all these land variables across basins and across basin boundaries, they are very, very strongly connected. There are two reasons possible. One may be the atmospheric variables are, they having a confounding effect, so they are affecting both the basins. The second one is that true land atmospheric feedback. So we wanted to focus on the true land atmospheric feedback. And also the other thing what we'd like to show is that we have tried to collect multiple government reports, and we wanted to understand that what are the major regions where there will be a interlinking. So when we are talking about this land atmosphere land connections, what we have found is that if you are considering land variables of different basins, they send strong information to the atmospheric variables of the same basins. Now, atmosphere doesn't have boundary, so atmosphere of one basin is easily connected to atmosphere of another basins. And again, so essentially, so if you consider land variables of basin 1 is connected to atmospheric variables of basin 1 through land atmospheric feedback. Now, atmospheric variables of basin 1 is now connected to atmospheric variables of basin 2, and atmospheric variables of basin 2 now sends this information to the land variables of basin 2. And in that way, all of them are connected. So this is some kind of a structure what we have found during a extensive causal analysis. Then we performed a warp simulation. So this is some kind of a sensitivity analysis, because we still don't know that what exactly will be the final implementation of interlinking of river basin. But what we have found is that if we go for a large scale interlinking of river basin with significant increase in irrigation at multiple different regions, then we found that it may have significant impact on September rainfall. Specifically over the September rainfall, the spatial pattern may get changed, which is very similar to what Anjana found when you are changing your water management pattern. So the point here is that if you are thinking of this kind of any kind of land water management practices, it's better to look at the entire water cycle, not just toward the land water cycle. So this is what is one of the major thing which we'd like to mention. And based on that, you should plan for interlinking of river basins so that every region get benefited, maximum benefits, so that maximum benefits are possible. And this is about the process which I just explained, that when it comes about interlinking of river basin, there is irrigation affects evapotranspiration, this affects temperature, this affects the cycle precipitation, and that results into more significant impacts on the spatial pattern of monsoon rainfall. Then the last part, because Vishal wanted me to include a little bit of it. So what we wanted to do is that I'll take another 5 minutes and then I'll complete. So it is about carbon cycle and water cycle. We know these two cycles are very, very important, and there is a very strong connection which is getting reported significantly by literature now. So we wanted to understand how carbon and water cycle are getting connected specifically over the Indian landmass. Why is this important, the Indian landmass? Because if you go to the 2019 the Nature Sustainability paper by Chen et al., where they showed that India is the second highest contributor to global greening after China. Of course, it is coming from agricultural intensification, but that also shows that it may play a major role, because we know that the amount of carbon dioxide we emit, 30% of it's being absorbed by the land. So we are trying to understand if there is a climate stress, what exactly happens to that quantity. So we wanted to understand that identifying the climate drivers of the variability of vegetation primary productivity. And second one is the role of carbon fertilization. So whenever carbon dioxide concentration increases, that increases the primary productivity as well as reduces the water loss. So we are trying to understand what will be its impact on the soil moisture and plant primary productivity, which is in terms of carbon dioxide capture or carbon uptake by the plants. So I'll go back to three nature papers. So from 2017 to 2021, there are three nature papers, and there has been a huge debate on this specific thing. So one of them is Jung et al., where it was said that, if you consider global scale and regional scale, the role of temperature and precipitation, they are entirely different. At the global scale, temperature plays a major role. And then there was a paper from ETH where it was mentioned, it came in Nature, that it tells us that if you are considering the global region, which is driven by the tropical regions vegetation, the total water storage is actually controlling the variability of carbon growth rate through vegetation productivity. And this was further said that soil moisture actually plays a major role in doing so. And it was also shown that, in the future, soil moisture's contributions will increase more, and soil moisture is actually, even VPT has any contribution on it, it is happening from soil moisture. Soil moisture affects VPT to land atmospheric feedback, and that results into change in the vegetation productivity. Now, one of our student, Elizabeth, was trying to understand what exactly is happening. Remember, all these nature papers, they of course concluded something on causation, but none of them really used causal method, which is very very difficult to understand why causal methods were not used, but the conclusions were made based on causes. And so what we wanted to ask, because correlation is not a measure of causation. So we wanted to understand what exactly is happening. So we wanted to plot total water storage, the carbon growth rate, variability, of course, removing the trend, which is because of anthropogenic activities, the photosynthetically active radiation, vapor pressure deficits, total water storage, and so on and so forth. What we have found is that, if you're considering the carbon growth rate variability, what we found is that we can see that the total water, if you consider the low frequency variability, that means when the total water storage has improved, the CGR has reduced. So our guess was that it was not really interannual variability. Probably this short-term trends have actually affected this correlation, and we need to check with the causal diagram whether it is really happening or not. So what we did is that we have applied Granger causality and PCMCI. And interestingly, what we have found is that we are unable to get total water storage to CGR any kind of link that is present. So whatever being concluded in the 2017 Nature paper, based on correlation, the proper causal algorithms, two different causal algorithms, really do not support them. Of course, it is about global analysis. But if you're considering even the regional analysis, we found exactly the same is happening. But we'll keep that apart, but we'll just focus on now what exactly is happening. What are the relative role of soil moisture and atmospheric aridity, vapor pressure deficit in India on the vegetation productivity? So even if you do the correlation, you just do not find exactly what is happening. But if you perform a more detailed analysis, which is based on conditional contribution, and when you do a conditional contribution, you can see that even like different other regions, even over India, soil moisture is one of the major thing that affects the vegetation productivity and vegetation carbon uptake. We have done it with conditional association, as well as we did some kind of a regression approach where we have taken the vegetation productivity, regressed it with vapor pressure deficit, took out the residuals and find out if the residual is associated with soil moisture or not. Essentially taking out one impact and then understanding the other impact. And for everywhere, what we have found is that soil moisture is the major driver. Now, the last part, what I said is that when the carbon dioxide concentration increases, what is happening is that there will be a partial closure of stomata under elevated CO2 concentration, and because of which what happens, the water loss reduces. And there is a hypothesis that because of which your soil moisture should increase and it should reduce the drought condition. So plants become more efficient, their water use efficiency increases. But at the same time, when there is a carbon dioxide concentration increases, there is a higher photosynthesis, because of which your leaf area index is increasing. So your individual leaf is actually losing less water. But as your leaf area index is increasing, the total transpiration may increase. So it may have a negative impact on soil moisture. So when you're talking about carbon dioxide concentration, its impact directly through vegetation acclimatization, then we'll get a different kind of impact. So the question comes is that does water use efficiency nullifies the impact of plant growth on soil moisture under CO2, under elevated CO2? So Akash Verma did some analysis. Of course, just now just few days back, this paper got accepted, where we have shown that whenever there is a carbon dioxide increase, what happens is that your leaf area index increases at a much higher rate, and because of which your vegetation your transpiration increases, and that results into slight decrease in soil moisture, which is mostly over the dry regions. So dry regions which are already affected by soil moisture deficit, they face more problem under carbon dioxide fertilization. So this is also another thing on which we are working. So there are different bits and pieces on which we are working on carbon cycle and water cycle. Have shown a very few. But finally, what I'd like to mention here is that, I have not listed the conclusions, but what I'd like to mention is that when you're looking at monsoon system, climate system, or any system, we have to look at the earth system, which is a connected component, which is a collection of different components. They are all connected with each other, and whenever there is a perturbation, each component will try to change themselves as well as their connections with other component, and the entire system goes through changes. And if you really have to go through changes and change in feedbacks. So if you have to understand the system, we have to take the holistic view rather than a compartmental kind of view. So that's all. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for this passionate talk connecting monsoon dynamics to impacts in India. We have time for a few questions. Can you pass it on? Right.
Thank you, sir, for this nice talk. This is Chetan from IISc. My question is there diurnal variation in rate of evapotranspiration? And if it is present, then at what time we see maximum or minimum rate of evapotranspiration?
Yes, there is definitely a diurnal variation, and when temperature is high, that time, of course, the evapotranspiration should be high, given that other conditions. So essentially, let's say the relative humidity, the wind velocity, on all of these factors, the evapotranspiration depends. It's a bit complex process. And to understand this process is also very important to understand, there should be a proper evapotranspiration measurements.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question? Maybe I will ask a question. Subimal, this is Vishal. So in this program, we have been discussing about a few timescales, timescale of the ocean, timescale of atmospheric memory, and so on. So can you give us a sense for what are the timescales that land-atmosphere interactions introduce in the system, and maybe water carbon cycle coupling, timescale associated with that we should be kind of thinking about?
So essentially what we have found is that if you're talking about the first part of the work, so essentially land atmospheric feedback, it happens at a more like an intra-seasonal scale. So essentially, when there is a water shortage, So plants react, and initially plants will try to resist, and then there will be a decrease in evapotranspiration and so on, and that will have impacts. And what we have found is that interseasonal scale signal then gets translated to interannual scale, and that will finally look at. Finally, we can see. Now, regarding this carbon cycle, this is also very similar, because as I said that soil moisture is one of the major driver that affects the primary productivity, what one of our student Nivedita found. So that also shows that essentially interseasonal scale is one of the most important scale, I feel, and that affects when it comes to land atmospheric feedback. But mostly they are prominent over the September month, because that's the time when land atmospheric feedback is quite high.
Thank you. I think maybe a corollary question, unless there is another question the students have. A corollary question is, so we have intraseasonal oscillations, I mean, of rainfall. So there is a kind of refilling of soil moisture, even if there is a dry down in the break period. So does this bring some unique features in India that may not be seen in other regions?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and one of our paper is just now under review in ERL, where what we try to understand is that if you're considering vegetation, water content, and soil moisture, so what we have found is that this vegetation water content is actually changed at interseasonal scale, but but with soil moisture it has a good lag. But with VPD, it happens at an instantaneous scale. So this is something which we have found, and this vegetation water content, of course, is collected from satellite data, which has its own uncertainty. But this is some of the scale which you have to understand, that how vegetation reacts to the soil moisture and so on.
Thanks, Subimal. Well, if there are no more questions, let's thank Professor Ghosh once again for this very nice talk. Subimal.
Thank you. Thanks, Vishal, and thanks, Parthoda, for switching the talk, because I had to give something at the institute level. Thank you.
I was thinking to meet you here actually.
I was supposed to come, but I had to cancel my ticket because, yeah.
Okay, you have to come to Berhampur now.
Sure.
Okay, all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.